New York Times revealed another meeting at Trump Tower in which representatives of foreign governments apparently offered to help the Trump presidential campaign. The Times reports that Blackwater founder Erik Prince arranged the meeting on August 3rd, 2016, with Donald Trump Jr., George Nader, who is an emissary for two wealthy Arab princes, and Joel Zamel, who is an Israeli social media specialist. According to the Times, quote, Nader told Donald Trump Jr. that the princes who led Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates were eager to help his father win election as president. The social media specialist, Joel Zamel, extolled his company's ability to give an edge to a political campaign. By that time, his firm had already drawn up a multi-million-dollar proposal for a social media manipulation effort to help elect Mr. Trump. The Times says Donald Trump Jr. responded approvingly, according to a person with knowledge of the meeting. The Times adds, quote, after Mr. Trump was elected, Mr. Nader paid Mr. Zamel a large sum of money described by one associate as up to $2 million. Donald Trump Jr.'s attorney released this statement on the meeting. Prior to the 2016 election, Donald Trump Jr. recalls a meeting with Erik Prince, George Nader, and another individual who may be Joel Zamel. They pitched Mr. Trump Jr. on a social media platform or marketing strategy. He was not interested, and that was the end of it. Erik Prince's role in arranging the meeting contradicts his under oath testimony to the House Intelligence Committee in a way that sure looks like perjury. According to the transcript of that under oath testimony, Erik Prince had this exchange with Congressman Tom Rooney. Mr. Rooney, okay, so aside from writing these papers, donating, supporting in a, Mr. Prince, yard sign in my yard, Mr. Rooney, yeah. So there was no other formal communications or contact with the campaign. Mr. Prince, correct. Joining us now, Brian Klaas, a fellow in global politics at the London School of Economics, and the co-author of the new book, How to Rig an Election, to be published tomorrow. And David Frum is back with us. And Brian, your reading of this new report of the meeting in Trump Tower.
Well, it's a pattern of disqualifying behavior and unconvincing denials from the Trump camp. It speaks to their willingness to at least attempt to collude with foreign actors in the election. And I also think it talks to the fact that they are actually willing to use business interests with groups like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to potentially influence foreign policy. Remember last June that Trump attacked Qatar on Twitter, for example, which is a rival of both the Saudis and the Emirates. And, you know, now we have to wonder, is it because of this behavior? Is it because of these meetings? And so I think what's clear is that there's this pattern of willing to collude. Whether or not they succeeded, right, they certainly tried. And I think that's something that is disqualifying, even if it is not illegal.
David Frum, there's so much to talk about here, but the one point that jumps out at me is just the casual ease with which Erik Prince perjures himself in testifying about his interactions with the campaign, saying nothing other than the lawn sign and contributing to something. And here he is, right in that meeting, Donald Trump Jr. confirming today through his lawyer that Erik Prince was in that meeting.
Well, here, that is astonishing. And here are a couple of other things that leap out at me from the story. The first is, notice the disparaging way that UAE and Saudi talk about Jared Kushner. Notice how Jared Kushner is doing business shortly thereafter with Qatar. It looks like what's going on here is a bidding war in which Qatar is placing its chips on Jared Kushner, and Saudi Arabia and UAE are trying to buy their way into Don Jr. And it's not that the campaign is for sale; it's a kind of auction with different countries buying different properties on the Trump monopoly board. I think Jared Kushner probably comes at a higher price than Don Jr. The other thing that is sort of striking is a name you didn't mention. That is Elliot Broidy, who was a business partner of George Nader, and many people remember him because he's the man who, although he usually hires very sophisticated lawyers, hired Michael Cohen to deliver funds to a woman with whom Elliot Broidy said he had an affair and had a baby who was then aborted by the woman. And the very next day, after the first of those payments issued, Elliot Broidy got a White House meeting with President Trump in December of 2017. There are a lot of suggestive pieces here in this puzzle. I think this is a meeting that's going to reward a lot of rich study in the days ahead.
Let's listen to what Congressman Adam Schiff said about it.
president and the Trump campaign were to solicit, to receive foreign help. Receiving, soliciting, using foreign assistance is a crime. You're not allowed to get the help of a foreign government, friendly or unfriendly.
And Brian, it's not at all clear what Donald Trump Jr. knew about the legalities of this.
Yeah, but that's not an excuse for a major presidential campaign. And I think one of the things, if we zoom out from this story, if you think about the drip, drip, drip of these stories of foreign influence in the election, if they all dropped at one time, we would have been shocked. We would have realized that this campaign had engaged in disqualifying behavior that meant they should be nowhere near America's national security, nowhere near America's secrets, nowhere near the integrity of our elections. And yet, because it's sort of every few months a new story comes out, the Trump Tower meeting of July, the Trump Tower meeting of August, these things are building a pattern that should really shock us. And I think, unfortunately, we're becoming numb to this pattern of disqualifying behavior. And every single time they deny it. And then there's more reporting, and it becomes clear that they're lying. And then eventually they acknowledge it, and again, the goalposts move. And so I think we need to be aware that this is not acceptable for anyone who is trying to become the president of the United States to behave like this, or for their family members to behave like this in the run-up to a presidential election.
Congressman Eric Swalwell said that what worries him about this is it seems that the word got out to more than one country about the vulnerability of the Trump campaign. Let's listen to that.
What is so unusual are the number of foreign nationals who were reaching out to the Trump campaign. I think part of what was going on here is that the candidate himself was inviting Russia to attack, and other countries started to see, well, this guy, he's open to doing business with anyone. He's transactional, he's gullible, so maybe we can get our interests before him. And so he is almost inviting them to come and make these different approaches.
David Frum, your reaction to that?
Well, Rudy Giuliani said, well, what about the rest of the world? Well, the rest of the world, I think, has stories, too. There's stories about Japan making special favors to Ivanka Trump during the transition. And China, of course, was sought out in the transition as an investor in Jared Kushner's dune building on Fifth Avenue.
David Frum, thank you for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Coming up, the collapse of Paul Ryan. First, he decides not to run for re-election to his House seat because he has a strong Democratic challenger, and now Republicans are talking about kicking him out of the speakership this summer.
We work at it.
The last thing you want is diplomacy to be ended, or to have a meeting with President Trump and you continue to play him, because they've done that for 30 years. Trump's not Obama. He's not going to tolerate that. He wants a win-win. If they don't show up, that's the end of diplomacy. If they do show up and try to play Trump, that means military conflict is the only thing left. And if we have a conflict with North Korea, they will lose it, not us.
And so we are back to military threats. The New York Times reports President Trump increasingly concerned that his summit meeting in Singapore next month with North Korea's leader could turn into a political embarrassment, has begun pressing his aides and allies about whether he should take the risk of proceeding with a historic meeting that he had leapt into accepting. On Thursday and Friday, Mr. Trump peppered aides with questions about the wisdom of proceeding, and on Saturday night, he called President Moon of South Korea to ask why the North's public statements seemed to contradict the private assurances that Mr. Moon had conveyed after he met Kim Jong-un. South Korean President Moon will meet with President Trump tomorrow to prepare for the summit with Kim Jong-un. Joining our discussion now, Rick Stengel, former Undersecretary of State in the Obama administration and an MSNBC political analyst, and Brian Klaas is back with us. And Rick Stengel, your reaction to the latest developments with this?
Well, Barack Obama used to say about any negotiation with another country is, we can't want it more than they do. President Trump wants it more than Kim does. President Moon is desperate for it. So that is the problem now. They have leverage over us. The other thing is, I want to make the case for good, old-fashioned, painstaking, boring diplomacy. And what that means is you have to negotiate before you deliver the president. You have to say, what do you mean exactly by denuclearization? I would wager that what we mean and what North Korea means are wildly apart. But nobody did that because Trump delivered the deliverable himself before any negotiation.
Brian.
Yeah, I think this is a continuation of the smoke and mirrors presidency. There's this flurry of activity, and people start to say, oh, is the Nobel Peace Prize something that Trump deserves?
Yeah.
And then it all falls apart. But his supporters believe he's won in North Korea already. They're going to continue to believe that. And I think what's really risky here is we go rushing into this gambit, a high-stakes summit, and it doesn't work because Trump doesn't do his homework, he doesn't listen to experts, and he doesn't get the job done, which is very likely because Kim is not likely to denuclearize without giving up anything that we would not be willing to live with, right? And so the real risk here is that once that diplomatic road ends, what else is there? And that, I think, is where we are rushing towards a very serious escalation of this conflict due to Trump's ignorance of diplomacy and his ignorance of the region.
And where would you go? What other administration, what other president would you swing between two extremes the way Donald Trump? Peace and Nobel Prize, or nuclear Armageddon? He has no in-between. I mean, he doesn't have a continuum because, as Brian says, he is ignorant. He doesn't know how to negotiate. He's in a position now where it's either a wonderful thing or a really disastrous thing, and that's not a good position to be in.
It seems like Lindsey Graham's decided that the good cop president needs a bad cop, and Lindsey Graham's going to be the bad cop and start threatening war again with North Korea.
Yeah, but that's extremely dangerous. I mean, we are talking about a conflict. If it's nuclear, it's going to be potentially millions of people. If it's a conventional war, Seoul could be decimated. And so we have very, very high stakes with a president who makes foreign policy on Twitter without running things by his aides, without listening to experts, without thinking the next strategic step forward. And now they've put out a coin that has Trump's face next to Kim Jong-un's. The White House has released this. And so they've now committed to it. I mean, they're putting the stamp of approval of the White House on the most murderous dictator, potentially aside from Assad, in the world. And so, you know, you're really legitimizing this force going into negotiations. They're giving up massive amounts of leverage, and we're careening towards a very dangerous breakdown of diplomacy with very little actual optimism around the prospect of them giving up their weapons.
We're going to have to leave it there for tonight. Rick Stengel, Brian Klaas, thank you both for joining us. Really appreciate it. Coming up, Paul Ryan's reign as Speaker of the House is supposed to end in January of next year, but some House Republicans want to get rid of him right now. Politico quotes a senior Republican source blaming House Speaker Paul Ryan for the collapse of the Republican Farm Bill last week. Obviously, the House Freedom Caucus is to blame, but this is the problem when you have a lame duck speaker who announces he's leaving 8 months in advance. He can make calls to members to urge them to vote for something, but who will care? Yeah, why announce 8 months in advance? Well, because some other candidate is going to have to run in your place, so you have to announce, and you should announce actually much sooner than that. So what other models do we have of a Speaker of the House deciding not to run for re-election to his seat and still maintaining control over the House? Well, there's Tip O'Neill, who announced in March of 1984 that 1984 would be his last re-election campaign. So he actually ran for his congressional seat in Cambridge, Massachusetts, as a self-proclaimed lame duck for what would be his final 2 years in Congress. And Tip O'Neill exercised his full authority as Speaker of the House every day of those final 2 years in Congress, with everyone in Washington knowing that Tip O'Neill was a lame duck. And when Tip O'Neill did not run for re-election in his district in 1986, the Democrats easily held on to his seat and picked up 5 more seats in the election of 1986. Paul Ryan's career in Congress is on its way to ending in a whimper unless it ends in outright humiliation by a group of Republicans who are reportedly plotting to throw Paul Ryan out of the speakership this summer. Not even let him serve out the rest of his term in the speakership. By the time Paul Ryan publicly announced he was not going to run for re-election for his seat in Wisconsin, he was already facing a strong Democratic challenge for that seat led by Randy Bryce. And now Paul Ryan may be facing a challenge to his remaining days as Speaker. He might just get kicked out by his own Republicans. Washington Post columnist E.J. Dionne will join us next to consider the collapse of the Ryan speakership. You know, I had actually forgotten some of those horrifying moments in what is now the recent history of the Justice Department, the last year and a half of the Justice Department. But the thing that we're dealing with tonight, the way Rod Rosenstein responded yesterday to the president's tweet and today in the meeting, the longer I've stared at it, find myself coming down on the side of what other choice did he have? That kind of thing, basically, that he lived to fight another day view of it.
And it's interesting, talking to Congressman Jim Himes from the Intelligence Committee tonight, talking to Ben Wittes from the Lawfare blog tonight, who's a very acute observer and a well-informed observer on these things. Both of them actually sort of came to the same conclusion, which is this is horrible appeasement. This is slippery slope stuff. They are giving away, they're breaking precedents that are priceless. And can you blame them?
Right.
Given the circumstances that they're in, maybe there is a greater good that they are trying to sacrifice for. The question is whether or not these sacrifices buy them anything toward that greater good. And we just don't know yet.
And I always found, I had to learn this actually, working in the Senate, that when the other side is demanding something of you, you always look at it as long as you can, trying to find, is there anything in there I can actually give them? Is there anything? And Rosenstein is now in politics in a way that a Deputy Attorney General hasn't been for a very, very long time. This takes us back to a previous era of American politics when the Justice Department was politicized.
Yes.
But in the modern era, it hasn't been. And so he's in politics now. And when he looks at a Trump moment, he has to look at it like a politician and figure out, is there a way I can deal with this that looks like I'm dealing with, that Trump will believe I'm dealing with it, at least.
But there's also sort of a, reptilian brain level at which this operates, which is when you show weakness, you invite bullying. When you give in, you invite the next shove to be even harder. And for the Justice Department to be breaking precedent over and over again, to be putting up sort of a feeble fight and then giving in, you've seen the way that the Trump administration and the president himself have reacted by asking for more and more outrageous, more outlandish, more damaging information and just forcing the Justice Department to give it and give it and give it to the point where they're now giving information that would be absolutely unimaginable for the Justice Department to cough up even a couple of months ago. The fact that they are apparently at this meeting going to give congressional investigators information about a confidential FBI source in an ongoing investigation, and this is something that the Justice Department sees as its crown jewels in terms of what it has to protect, human sources in live investigations. The fact that they're going to hand that over in some way, shape, or form tomorrow or whenever they're going to host this meeting, that's the incremental appeasement ultimately gets you to a place where you behave in ways that you never could have seen yourself behaving even quite recently.
And Rod Rosenstein has to be wondering that every day and every night. What is Trump going to demand of me next?
Yeah.
And is that the moment where I have no choice but to resign? What is that next thing he's going to ask for?
Yeah, and where is my unbreakable? Where am I unbreakable? Where can I? Where would I know that I am doing more damage by saying yes than by saying no? I mean, it's all of these lines that you would have drawn in advance of this situation, we have already passed.
Yeah,
it's just now that we're in them, each new calculation brings us into uncharted territory.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks, Lawrence.